Good day, everybody. I'm glad to have you joining me. I'm so excited, actually, to have you join me for this very special live stream conversation with Dan Rockwell. You might know him as the leadership freak. So let's just start here. So first of all, if you're here, I'm glad that you're here. And I hope that you will stay with us and enjoy this conversation. The reason this conversation is happening is because a few weeks ago, we had our annual virtual LeaderCon event, and Dan graced us with the chance to join us as one of our guests. And then we had technical challenges. We'd been going for a couple of days and had no problems with anybody. And yet when Dan got here, we had all sorts of troubles. And so we didn't end up able to have him there. So I promised we would do this event. So here's the thing. If you're here and you were at Virtual LeaderCon, I would then presume is why you're here right now, in the chat of whatever social platform you're on, just say, I was at VLC or something along those lines. I'd love to know that. And the other thing I'd like you to do in the chat is to tell us where you're located. And the third thing I'd like you to do in the chat, not like I'm giving you homework or something, but the third thing I'd like you to do in the chat is if you've heard of Dan Rockwell, the leadership freak, tell us that. So we'll put those three things in the chat. I'll get to those in a second. That's what you can do in this moment. And while you're deciding to do that, let me just tell you that throughout the course of this conversation, I hope that you will continue to ask your questions and add your comments and your ideas, because it'll make for a greater and more effective and richer conversation along the way. So before we get into this, let me tell you that this event today is brought to you by my newest book, Flexible Leadership, Navigate Uncertainty and Lead with Confidence. It's time that we realize that styles can get in our way and that following our strengths might not always be the best approach. In a world more complex and uncertain than ever, leaders need a new perspective and a new set of tools to create the great results their organizations and their team members want, need, and deserve. That's what this new book, Flexible Leadership, is all about. You can learn more about that and pre-order your copy at remarkablepodcast.com/flexible. That's what you can do to do that. And let's just see. I'm going to bring Dan in, but before I introduce him, we're going to see comments are flowing in. We've got people that were at VLC. Hi, Cheryl. We've got more people from VLC. We got people not at VLC, but is in Northern Illinois. Someone who's on Dan's daily email, of which, Bill, there are many. Hello, Lisa. I know you, Lisa. More people who were at VLC, and you are in Iowa. Happy Halloween to you in Iowa and to everywhere. Oh my gosh. Miss Dawn is here. Yes, I've known Dawn forever. And I know that she happens to be a fan of yours as well, Dan, because we've had that conversation. So here we go. Let me introduce this fine young man to you, everybody, and then we'll dive in. Dan Rockwell is a leadership enthusiast dedicated to serving others. That's why he's here. He's the co-author of The Vagrant, The Inner Journey of Leadership. I'll find the link to that because we talked about that book on the podcast a few months ago. He's been recognized by Inc. magazine as one of the top 50 leadership and management experts and as one of the top 100 great leadership speakers. The AMA recognized him as a top 50 leader in business. His blog, Leadership Freak, is read in every single country in the world. He has an MBA as well as degrees in theology, pastoral ministry, and construction and design. Dan, you're probably the only person on the planet that has that set of degrees. He has owned three businesses, served as workforce development consultant for a Penn State University special affiliate. Currently, he coaches leaders, writes to elevate leadership excellence, which he does at an excellent level. And I'm so glad that you're here with me today. We get to do this, even though we tried to do it a long time ago.
Yes, we do. It seems like things are working as well. So that's helpful, right?
Yes. You can be seen and heard. For all of you that were on VLC when this happens, there's all this stuff that happens before we actually bring the next guest up. And Dan was in with Lisa and it was working. And then I got in there and it was working. I think maybe had a little bit of a hiccup, but it was working. And we went live like we'd done hundreds of times in the past and over a dozen times in the previous 24 hours. And then nothing. He couldn't see us. He couldn't hear us. We couldn't hear him. And So here we are today. So the loss of that day is the win of today for people. So, it's interesting to me because, when we asked you to be on VLC, we said we can talk about whatever you want, and you said let's talk about delegation, and especially how delegation can be an energy creator. And so I'm curious, why did you pick that, and really why should we as leaders be thinking about being better delegators?
Right, right. Well, so often delegating is viewed as giving somebody a job to do, or here, even better, getting something off my plate. That's the main motivation. And frankly, it's great to get stuff off your plate, but there's so much more to it. And the thought that you might delegate to energize someone, you might delegate to help someone get where they want to go instead of just what you need to get done. Those kind of things are important. I mean, the task part is easy. Boom, 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 boom. Like most people, and I shouldn't say that. Sometimes newly promoted managers struggle to, no, a lot of people struggle to delegate.
Yeah, I was going to say, you're making.
But
I mean, if people didn't struggle, no one would want to be here. Like we need to have a different topic, right?
Right. So, but there is more to it than just saying, let's go. I need to give you a job. I need you to do something. I think we're talking about really thinking about how to energize someone while you're giving them a new responsibility.
So there's a lot we can unpack from what you've already said. One of the things that I often say is if the only reason you're delegating is to get it off of your plate, you're likely going to do it wrong. You really are going to likely do it wrong, or you're going to do it in such a perfunctory way that it won't ultimately be very successful, right? So one of my bosses once said, well, the story is that I was writing about delegation and remarkable leadership, and I reached out to two of the guys who I'd worked for, who I thought were excellent at it, and I asked them, and one of the things they said, well, are you writing about being the delegatee or the delegator? I said, because if we're talking about being the delegatee, the first thing you got to do is no one wants to be dumped on. People don't mind being delegated to, but they don't want to be dumped on. And so I think that's, so let's actually start here. You said it's easy, but yet maybe it's not. And we talked about the fact that maybe we sometimes hesitate to do it, even though most every leader will say you really need to learn how to do it. Like, why is there so much tension there between we know we oughta and yet we don't?
That's a big question, isn't it, Kevin?
Well, I don't want to ask you easy ones.
Yeah, right. I mean, let's start with the internal reasons that a leader might be reluctant to delegate. And, one of the questions to ask yourself is, how am I at giving ownership to someone else? How willing am I to let go of things? Because you rise to a position in leadership because you're great at taking hold of things and getting them done. And it's a huge shift. And it's sort of like, remember the old trucks? We had an old pickup truck on the farm where you had to double clutch it or you grind the gears. In other words, you push a clutch in, take it out, then push a clutch in again and put it in the next gear. You got to get that transition from I'm an individual contributor to no, I'm helping other people contribute. So it could be attitude about self. And that's probably a big one that we need to reflect on.
No, I think that's huge. We got promoted because we were good at doing stuff. And now we've got to not do all the stuff because we can't do all the stuff. Right. Okay. So why should we do it? Like, what's the reasons that we ought to be doing it beyond just getting it off of our plate?
Right. We ought to delegate because we want to go further than we can go by ourselves. I mean, that's a personal level. We want to delegate because we want other people to go further. We want them to rise to new responsibilities. And believe me, good people rise to responsibility when they have authority. They don't necessarily rise to a task, go mop the floor. that is not necessarily something that, yeah, right. It's not like, oh, I get to, you
but
run home.
unless we can attach a meaning to that.
Yes, yes, yes. But they do rise to something that is meaningful. And when you bring up meaning, Kevin, and I think the idea of what's the impact is important when talking about delegating something. And I think there are three arenas, probably more, where you think about what's the impact. What's the impact on me if I take on this new responsibility? What's the impact on our organization or our team? What's the impact? And I'm using the term impact in the context of like purpose and mission and meaning, but impact speaks to me. And then the third area, of course, is what's the impact on the customer? And tell me how it's impacting people. And we'll go back to mopping the floor. You say to somebody, this hallway, mop this hallway. There's not much responsibility. We don't really think about the impact. You could say, we're working to create a great impression on the people who come to visit us in the office. You are an impression builder. You're going to be the first in the line of several people who build the right impression for our organization. I mean, that's a simple illustration, but we rise to impact. We don't rise to a job.
Yeah, we rise to impact. I love that. As you're telling that, using that example, I'm thinking about the perhaps true, perhaps mythical story about President Kennedy. It might not have been Kennedy. It might have actually been Lyndon Johnson at someplace at NASA, right? It probably was President Johnson now that I think about it. But he's walking around at NASA and he sees a janitor and he asks the janitor what he does. He says, I'm helping send a man to the moon. Right? Like, I don't even know if it's a true story, but it's a good story. And it's exactly your point. Like, I'm not just mopping the floor. I'm making this part up, everybody. I'm not just mopping the floor. I'm making sure no astronauts fall. Like, yeah. I'm creating a sense of pride here for all that walk down these hallways, whatever that might be. Like, it's a totally different thing. And I think that as leaders, so reflect, tell me what you think of this. So I think as leaders, a lot of times we make the connection between the task and the purpose. And so we think others see it and they often don't. Comment, thoughts about that?
It's true. And often in a delegating conversation, we rush to tactics. We rush to how to get it done, how to do this, how to do that. And you can't help it. I see it all the time. And so I think it's okay to let go there for a minute, but I think it's important then to rise up and start to talk about what are we really trying to get done? What are we really, what's the deeper impact that we're trying to achieve? And, we're talking about things like we're trying to connect people. We're trying to make someone's life more productive. We're trying to make someone's life easier. We're trying to take someone where they want to go. There are lots of things that hopefully, the thing you're doing connects to something bigger than the actual task. So we rush to tactics. And I think that's a challenge for people who are delegating.
Well, and there's lots of reasons that happens, but I love Dawn's point. Delegate for agency, not task, which is a way at getting at a lot of the things that you're saying. One of the reasons we end up at tactics. So thoughts on this. I see that leaders often are delegating and the underlying thing in their head is, I want them to do it exactly like I do it. And so if I need you to do it, if I want you to do it exactly like I do it, then it's way more likely we end up in tactical.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that, like you said, you got promoted because you're great at something and the people around you aren't as good at you as you are at that thing. I mean, until you get to a certain place in leadership, your first promotions are because you're very competent. And now you have people working for you who are not as competent as you. Well, you buckle up, buddy, because that is the reality of it, right? And so now we think about what energizes people, learning, growth. So when we think about delegating, who do we pick? The one who is competent or the one who is 70, 80% competent? It depends, of course, on whether, you're betting the farm on something. But if you're not betting the farm, somebody who is 60% competent, and you say, this is a learning opportunity for you, this is going to expand your opportunities. Say, what's in it for others, what's in it for me, the impact. And so think about when you do this. To energize someone, people love to learn and grow. The exception to that is, of course, older employees who are not as enthusiastic about development and growth. They're sort of like, I'm pretty well good. I'm good. Thank you. But younger aspirational leaders, we can talk about delegating to aspiration, but younger aspirational leaders are going to be much more eager to learn and grow.
So let's talk about both sides of that, because it was one of the things I'd hoped that we would talk about a little bit was, who do we delegate to? And I've been asked 100 times, like, how do I manage or how do I coach the person late in their career, right? And so you bring that up here in the frame of delegation. So if I need or want to delegate something to someone who's got, I don't know, hair the color of ours, we'll just say that. What advice do you have? Because I want to come back a little bit more to the aspirational piece and the growth part and all that stuff. But like, what is your advice if we are delegating to someone later in their career with a different set of value propositions for the work?
Yes. And I think you're hitting on the key idea. And what are one of them, at least? What are their values? What is important to them? And it could be mentorship. It could be the influence that they're having in the organization on others, especially younger people. It could be legacy. How do you want to be known? It could be that. So, what's in it for them? What's in it for others? That question is pretty useful. And I think if you can touch on what's in it for them, like legacy, like mentorship, like the sage, I want you to be the sage. You're the man of experience, and we need your experience here. You're the woman of experience.
Yeah, I often think about, and I love that. And the thing, I would add two things. One is, not only should we be thinking about what we think it is that would be valuable to them, but we should ask them, like, what are the things that still excite you? I mean, the frame of this conversation is energizing and delegating, right? So it's kind of like, what are the things that are energizing you at work today? It's not the same as if I'm talking to that person who's more senior.
Yes.
I realize it's not the same as when you had kids in school, and that's different now. And I want to know, like, what are the things that get you or would get you more excited about being at work? So having that conversation sets us up to help determine the better things to delegate them over time. But I love the point about legacy. Like, that's the one that I point to a lot. I always tell people, like, if someone's been in your organization for a while, they want to leave it a better place than what they found it. And if you can help them see how taking on a new responsibility can help that happen, then you got a more willing set of ears, I think.
Yeah. Wonderful. Is there is a large group of people in organizations who are closer to retirement, and it's an untapped resource, especially when it comes to how do you want to impact the organization at large, because you can do it in ways others can't. People pay attention.
100%. So here's the dichotomy that we've outlined so far. We really ought to wanna delegate. There's some reasons why it's sometimes hard for us to, and yet now we know there are some really good reasons to do it. Like, in other words, we know we should, but we don't, and we know why it would be valuable to do it. If that's where someone who's listening is, like, they're in that mental tension, how do you encourage them, or what's your advice for them to get started? Like, how do they get started?
How do you get started in delegating?
Yeah.
That is a great question. Perhaps one way to try is to write down every single thing you're doing. Just take a week and write down everything or even just a couple of days, and
I'm
just start writing
exhausted just thinking about that, Dan.
Exactly. Exactly. Just start writing this stuff down, and then start circling or crossing out the things that they're essential for your job, right? And then you have a list of potential opportunities where you could delegate responsibility, right? And everything you do is an essential.
I was going to say, everybody, if you do what Dan just said, and then you cross everything off, we need to talk because it's not all essential, right? But you know what? I think there are some leaders that's where they are. They have a hard time.
Yeah.
I love, by the way, I love the way you did that, which is do it the opposite way. Like, what's the stuff fundamentally that I know I can't delegate, right? Because they're essential. And so for a variety of reasons, and there's some things that are on our plate that we can't give to anybody else. Right.
Yes.
So like for me, one of the things that I'm not going to give to anybody else is writing. And no one else is going to shoot this video with you, at least not for the same purpose. Right. So there's certain things that I need to do. I'm not going to delegate that. But we have to find that list for all of us so that we can find the not to do list, which is what you're talking about. Right.
Sure.
I love that. I love that. So something that often gets connected to delegating is micromanagement. Right? It's maybe it's the other side of the coin. Either we don't give it away, so we are seen as micromanaging, or we do give something away, and then we're watching so closely. Like, how talk from your perspective. And by the way, if we're micromanaging, we're not energizing people. Let's be clear about that. So, like, talk about the connection for you between delegating and micromanaging.
Right. Don't.
Okay, next question.
Yeah, next question. I mean, it is true. And we're back to the idea that if you're struggling with delegating, you got to start with yourself. It isn't just about a tactic. So now we got, how do I view myself? And now it's time to work on, questions like, what kind of person doesn't delegate? A perfectionistic, controlling, arrogant, and we don't have to say arrogant. I like to say it, but a perfectionistic, controlling person. I mean, let's just face it. That's the kind of person who doesn't delegate. They can do it better than anybody else. So, humility is important. Yeah, a martyr. Oh, yeah. We got to add this, Kevin. We got to add the wrongfully compassionate leader who doesn't delegate because they're protecting everybody. You know what I mean? Oh my goodness. Look, self-care and compassion are big these days, and it's important. But when compassion leads to protecting people, it's destructive. It's you got some delusional thing going on in your mind because you're not really helping people at all. So anyway,
that makes me think of the parent that goes with the kid to the job interview. This is not helpful.
Yeah.
I love that phrase, by the way. If I remember one thing from this conversation, personally, it'll be wrongfully compassionate. That's a great way to describe it because it describes the unintended consequence.
Yeah.
Because it's unintended, right?
It is. I think there are some shifts in thinking. Like, for example, ease is boring. See, we don't want to put weight on people. And you have to think realistically about this. So what are you actually saying? I don't want, our people to have, I don't want to put weight on people. Ease is boring. It's the hard things that are energizing. I don't get energized because, it's easy. I get energized because it's challenging. Now, you're going to have to work on what's the right amount of challenge. And the simplest thing to do for that is to talk to the people, just talk to them. Say, talk, and your one-on-ones, just keep track. What's your level of what, you said it in a one-on-one, you regularly ask, what's energizing you? Keep mental notes, right? I like physical notes. Write that down. What energizes? How can you do more of that? That's an important question. Another question is, on a scale of 1 to 10, how stressed are you? And they say, well, I'm a 7. Second question is more important. And that is, what level of stress energizes you? What level of stress keeps you excited? And they might say 9,
or they might say 4, right? But you don't know that. Or they might say 7.
No.
Like, that's a really great second question. Really.
Yeah. Well, the second question is the powerful question. And that one is, it helps for reflection. So the first question is, what's energizing you? The second question is, what is it about that that's energizing you? Because you may have a message in your head. So once you find out that stuff, now we can delegate to energize, because this stuff energizes people, that person.
Yeah, I love that. So, in the few minutes that we had before I hit the let's go live button, I mean, that's not what the button actually says, but before I hit the button that says live, you said, let's make sure we talk about if I'm a leader of leaders, if I'm a leader in the middle, and my direct reports are or include leaders, what do I need to do to make sure they're delegating? Or what do I do if they're not delegating?
Yeah. I think it's a real issue. And I think, as you said, one, you get good at doing it yourself. You get good at giving ownership and sharing responsibility and understanding the right amount of check-ins. Too many check-ins means I don't trust you. All that kind of stuff, which can be, again, with conversations with the person you're delegating to. You talk to them about, how frequently would you like to touch base? And, if it's not enough for you, you say, look, I have to give I'm accountable for certain things. So please understand, I'm going to need something, because I got to go upstairs with something on so I may need, but fundamentally, if you can let the person determine how much. And track record matters here, right? If they have a track record of rising, go to bed and sleep. I mean, just relax. If they don't have a track record of rising, if they're new, that is a little more stressful. And and don't give them something where failure is catastrophic, where you're wringing your hands. Your question, though, I went off track a little. Look, bird. I'm just chasing things all over the place.
Yeah, I say squirrel, but same difference. Oh, look over there.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
I didn't answer what to do.
Go on this whole thing for a long time, chasing a lot of birds. But let's go back specifically to the question of helping other leaders to delegate. Yes.
So first of all, get good at yourself, and then here's something to say. Here's a statement. Say to one of these managers who doesn't delegate well, I have a job that needs to get done. Who on your team would be great at that? So what you're doing is you're setting
the expectation of it right from the start.
Yeah, right from the start. It's not like, because here's the first thing a lot of people think: I got a job to delegate, blah, blah, blah. I got you, boss. Yeah.
This just went to the top of their list. Like, I got to take care of the boss, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So just set the tone right from the beginning, so that you let them know you want them to talk to someone else. Who on your team, and look and wait. I get a name or two. You might say, who? Second question, who else? And
then when will you talk? When will you delegate this to them? I mean, if you
depending
on the situation and the timeline and all that stuff, then you can go right down that line. Or if you think that they still will keep it themselves, you need to create a little more accountability. I had something I was going to mention earlier, then I lost it. I may come back to it, but I want to get Barbara's question in here, which is a really good one. Thoughts about delegating to a group rather than an individual?
Well, Wow. It sounds like a nightmare. You you might have to. You delegate to a team. I don't know. See, I haven't thought about this, so my gut response is run for the hills. I'll say this: if you do delegate to a group, every project needs a champion. There needs to be one person who is like the person. You're not gonna, if you delegate some responsibility to 5 people, you're not gonna get reports from 5 people.
And you don't want reports from 5 people. Oh, by the way, right?
Right. So my quick thought is, who's the champion? Who's the person who is going to report out what the results are, or keep, say we need some help or whatever it is, we got an issue. Who's that person? And work with them.
Yeah, it's interesting because the first thing that crossed my mind was if you're doing that, you fundamentally are creating a project, right? And if there's a project, and I go exactly to where you went, so I think we're in alignment on that, for sure.
I'm always in alignment with you, Kevin, and I always agree with everything you say.
Okay, well then that's a problem. We should probably end this right now. And but my father used to say, Dan, that it always is a long time. Like it's a long time. So I don't know if that's completely true, but I do think that we've spent enough time together and we've read each other's stuff long enough that we are of like mind. I think that's a fair statement, for sure.
Absolutely.
Oh, Barbara says that's not the response she was expecting. So now, Barbara, curious minds named Dan and Kevin want to know what you were expecting, because maybe you got a better answer. Want to know? Like, we would be curious, I think, to know what that would be. While we're waiting on that, perhaps, and you certainly don't have to, Barbara, but I want to go back to something that you said earlier, and I'm gonna be transparent. One of the things that's been hardest in my career to delegate, and I think I'm finally getting a little better at it, is delegating the stuff that is easy. Because I believe that the people that are around me are incredibly talented and incredibly valuable. And I always I've always had a hard time giving, so I have a person that for a long time, I've had a person on the team that at least in part you would say, well, they're like your assistant. Okay. And that's not what I would call them, but that's the easiest way for this conversation. So, and I have often found, well, that's so easy. I should just do that. I don't want to give it to them. They're going to feel like that's the stupidest thing ever. There's not going to be any energy for them in doing that. So I'll keep it. Yeah. And yet I know, and I've even had them tell me, no, Kevin, that's what I'm here for. It's okay. And yet that's been that at times in my career has been really hard for me. I'm better at it than I used to be. But
you remind me of some conversations I've had with some of the folks that I work with who are not wanting to put things on others and, overburden or whatever. And I'll say, do your people love you? And I don't mean romantically, but do they love you? Are they committed? Do they really appreciate you? Oh yeah, they're great. I said, look, I promise you, if you got on the phone right now and called one of them in and said, look, it would really help me if you did this. I got a lot of stuff on my plate right now, and I'm not one to want to just throw things on people. It would really help me if you could take this. You think you could fit this in? What are they going to say? They're going to stand and salute, and they're going to walk out of the office feeling great. I'm helping the boss.
I think you're exactly right. I really do. Barbara said she did not think that you were going to say it was a nightmare. She said that what often energizes her team is working together, so she considers delegating groups. So to me, that's a perfect answer, because what that says to me, Barbara, is that you know your folks, and that says something about your organizational culture too. You want to add to that, Dan?
No, it's wonderful. It fits more into the project thing. I would hold to every group, every project, everything delegated does need a champion. But it's great. It's a collaborative environment. It seems, and it's working. Can't beat it.
All right, we got another. Yeah, if it's working, right, and there's not unintended consequences, keep doing it. How would you recommend an employee mention to a supervisor that doesn't delegate that they need to? How do you manage up if your boss isn't delegating? Another way to ask that question, I think. Thoughts on
Yes.
that one?
How do you manage up if your boss isn't delegating? I have this coaching lens, right? So it may not be relevant here, but I'm thinking about I would I would ask my boss about how busy they are. I would ask them the same questions we might like the boss to ask us. What's energizing you? What's draining you, boss? And kind of just have that conversation, and then at some point offer to do it. The other thing in me, and this is again my nature, is just start doing some of their work for them. Just do it. If you can, and apologize after, or say, I'm trying to be helpful. It's a tough question. What do you think,
Good
Kevin?
question. The only thing I think that's really good. I think the thing I would add is I probably wouldn't ask them. I wouldn't use the D word. I wouldn't use the delegate word because
Yeah.
from where we started, all of us as humans, who as leaders, have even those who are really skilled and willing to delegate. We have these mixed emotions about it, right? And there's at least a part of us that says if we have to delegate, that we can't get it done, and we ought to be able to get it done. So I think using Dan's advice is great advice, but I probably wouldn't use what could you delegate to me, because that's not how you said it. And I just would add, and don't say it that way, because that could. I'm making this a bigger thing than it is in a way, but that could trigger someone in a way you don't mean for it to, and create some resistance that you don't mean for it to, or create guilt for them that you're not trying to do. You're just trying to be helpful, and in being helpful, you know that what you're going to get in response for you as the delegated to is the chance for growth and energy and all of those other good things, right? And Earl says, I haven't read this yet, but here it comes. Earl says, I would ask the boss what development options I have for myself that you might be able to help me with. That's another way to go at it. That's sort of that bigger version of the question, where Dan's version of the question is more like in the moment. Like, what could I do to help you right now? What do you really need? Where are you? How's your workload? And is there something I can do to help? Kinds of questions. It's another great way to look at it. Anything you would add to that, Dan?
Oh, it's fantastic. You gotta feel your way along with the boss and with the manager or the different people respond differently. And, if perhaps doing your best to build a good relationship is a pretty good place to start, to try to build a relationship with them.
People are more likely to delegate to us when they trust us. And so anything that we're doing to build relationship, to build trust, is moving in the direction of making it safer and easier and more likely that people will then say, hey, could you help me with this kind of thing? I love that. So is there something, Dan, as we start to think about wrapping up here, is there something that I didn't ask that you wish I would have, or something we didn't talk about around energy and delegation that we should have?
It's not a question. There are a couple of things that do come to mind. Don't rush to help. Don't be the savior leader, and let people grapple with it and struggle with it. You can monitor the frustration level. Again, you're not going to bet the farm on something and let it go. But in a lot of situations, don't rush to help, because it trains people to depend on you instead of on themselves. Right. So you got to talk to them. What's your stress level? Talk about progress. You got to take perfection. I mean, you got to take progress versus perfection, but don't rush to help, because if you rush to help, all you're doing is training people that you are going to help them, and they're just going to keep running to you over and over again for help. It's like the leader who quickly answers questions all the time. They got a million questions all the time because they're answering. Don't do other people's job for them. Just don't. So let them look at it.
You're training people how to work with you, right? So if the boss keeps swooping in, we can expect they're going to keep swooping in, and it becomes learned helplessness in a way, right?
Yes.
And we're not after that. I love that. It's a great point. So one of the things that I wasn't going to ask, that I always ask on the podcast, but I wasn't going to ask today until you and I were chatting before we started. And then I thought, well, maybe I'll ask anyway. So for some reason, you mentioned a book to me when we started this conversation. You actually mentioned two, but we really had a conversation about one. And so, as you know, having been on the podcast, that I always ask, what are you reading? So would you just tell people, and you can pick a different book if you want, but I would love for you to share, because I think there's a connection between what you share with me about this book and delegation. So the question is, what's something that you've read that you think people might find useful?
So I am going to read again. It's in my second read category because I want to work through it more slowly. I'm going to read again the book, 7 Primal Questions. Mike Forster, I think is the name, or Foster. I didn't look it up, but Mike Foster. And you want me to tell you the impact it had on me? I mean, I can do that, or do you have time for that? What is it?
No, that's
40?
Yeah.
So he says, everybody's asking this set of questions. He picks 7. I've done some reading on it. There's probably a dozen or 15 that we ask ourselves. Things like, am I loved? Am I in control? Do I have control? Am I wanted? Am I respected? There are a bunch of questions. And so he says he gave the 7 that he's doing in his book. And I'm reading about it. And then he finally says, look, one of these questions really speaks to you. And I looked at the list and I knew immediately what the question was. And learning this question has developed in me a greater sense of freedom. It has had a huge impact on just my personal attitude about myself and my interactions with others. So my primal question is, am I wanted? And so what that comes out as is, I will do anything in my power to avoid anybody indicating I'm not wanted. So I'm going to stay away. I'm going to be on the fringes. I'm not going to send you a bunch of text messages. I'm not going to send you emails, because I don't want you on the other end thinking, oh my word, it's Dan Rockwell again. I can't bear this. And the thought of that just sends me into overload. So I have learned I have a greater sense of freedom. Not everybody wants me, and that's fine, but a lot of people do. And it's okay. I know I told you I'd go to I don't travel and speak anymore, but I would go and speak somewhere, conference or a business, and I'd stay on the fringes. I don't want to interrupt people. I don't want to bother anybody. I would tell myself, I learned this even before I read the book. I would be walking on the platform to the front, get ready to give a presentation, and I would tell myself, these people want me here. Because I was so worried about this, and they want me to do well, so that just seeing it has given me a greater sense of freedom. 7 primal questions.
I appreciate you sharing that, and the observation that I will make for everybody is that where Dan and I started with this conversation, is that delegation starts in here, between our ears and in our heart, before we get to the tactics of doing it and who to do it, who to do it to, and all that stuff. And do it with is a better way to say it, but you know what I'm saying. And so I think whether it's that book or other things that helps us understand our motives, what gets us stuck, what causes us anxiety, there are some of those things, especially loaded into our role as leader, that are some of the reasons why we don't delegate, even though we know we should. And maybe that's as good a place as any to leave us. Dan, it's such a pleasure to be with you. I've been looking forward to this. I looked forward to it, and then it didn't happen. And so I got to look forward to it again. If you haven't, everybody, you want to make sure you get a copy of Dan's book, The Vagrant. I can't remember the last time I read a business book. This is a parable, and I've read plenty of those that I read. I sat down to read it in preparation to have Dan on the show, and I got up when I finished it. And having read a lot of them, if you've done that, and this is no disrespect to the many people who've written parables, several of whom I know, they can be very formulaic. Dan's is not. That's all I'm going to say about it. It's not as formulaic as most of them, which is one of the reasons I couldn't put it down. So you want to make sure you get a copy of The Vagrant. You want to make sure you're connected with Dan. Where do you want to point people, Dan, if they want to connect with you and weren't aware of you until today because they were living under a rock?
Leadershipfreak.blog. You can go there. My email address is dan@leadershipfreak.com. Send me a note, and that's about it. You know, I'm with you. I'm on LinkedIn and all those other places, and whatever.
Look at this. People are putting the link to the book right there. Lots of people saying thank you. I want to thank you, of course, Dan, for being with us. But I'm going to do one other thing that I ask on all of our podcast episodes before we say goodbye, everybody. And that's the question I will ask is the same one I ask at the end of every podcast, which is now what? What action are you going to take now as a result of this? And man, there was plenty here for you to think about. And I hope that you don't leave this conversation just saying, well, that was pretty good. Yep. Dan's a smart guy. But that you leave saying, what do I need to be doing differently to delegate more effectively, to delegate in ways that help to energize others, to grow other people, and to grow our business and to grow our organizational capability. If you'll take action, this will have been worth way more than it would have been otherwise. Dan, thanks so much for being here. Such a pleasure to have you, my friend.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
Thanks, everybody. And if you enjoyed this, you might want to make sure, if you're not already, make sure you sign up. Go to wherever you listen to your podcast and sign up for the Remarkable Leadership Podcast with me. This was not on it, but you can find the episode I did with Dan there. And we release a new episode every week. If you're happening watching on wherever you're watching, like on LinkedIn or whatever, we're here on a regular basis as well to do the live streams that eventually become those podcasts. Hope you do that as well. And I hope you all have a fabulous day. And for those of you watching live, happy Halloween. Thanks, everybody.